and what does it mean for prevention? So one of the interesting parts of all this, and I'm going to focus on the Einsatzgruppen, which was a task force or a mobile unit that went in after the German army did to secure the area. But basically, they went in there prior to the concentration camps to kill Jewish citizens and others. So between 1941 and 1943, these mobile units killed over 1.5 million people, mainly Jews, but others as well. And they did this in Poland, in Ukraine, in Russia, in Lithuania. And I started focusing more on the Lithuanian case. A lot of interest. I'm actually listening to Sylvia's book right now when I walk. And so I can tell you I've walked 2 hours and 30 minutes in the last couple of weeks. And this week I'm going to plan to do another 3 hours because I really, really love the book. And it's just amazing work. And it's consistent with what I'm trying to study as well, but from a different view as far as my focus. So how did this Einsatzgruppen group came about from Hitler's police and security service? Tended to be highly educated, attorneys, economists, and they were divided up into different groups and then into even smaller units. So you end up getting each Einsatzgruppe unit had around maybe 500 to 800 men in it. So you can actually start studying these individual units and then even studying their leaders, which I did in one case. I chose one and decided to study him. Interestingly enough, I have another one and I have a book I haven't read yet. And now I make the connection that this guy I'm going to do a case study on in the future was the leader of the Einsatzgruppen, along with the Lithuanian partisans who killed most of my grandfather's family. So I've been looking all at that. It does get pretty intense because now I'm getting names and stuff, and being in criminal justice, you start getting curiosity and tracking this stuff down. I think maybe I don't know how much deeper I should go into it. When professional academic research becomes personal, a lot of times I think that happens. But for my 30 plus years of academic research, it's never happened before. So I'm moving very slow. So the Einsatzgruppen went into these countries basically and killed people with firing squads. And the interesting part is that citizens of these countries assisted. They also had the order police, which was a group of police formed by the Nazis, and they assisted. But what caught my attention was the Lithuanian activists and nationalists and other partisan groups that formed. And I remember when I was a young kid, my grandfather told me that a bunch of his family, my aunts and uncles and they had been, and cousins had been killed by the Nazis and the Lithuanians. And it wasn't until maybe 5 or 6 years ago I started to put it together. I always thought Nazis. I never even knew this story that Lithuanian citizens had anything to do with it. And now I'm realizing they did. Otto Ohlendorf was the chief of Einsatzgruppe D, and during the trial, this is what he stated as far as what the Einsatzgruppen, they were responsible for all political security tasks within the operational area. In addition, they had the task of clearing the area of Jews, communist officials, and agents. The last named task was to be accomplished by killing all racially and politically undesirable elements seized who were considered dangerous to the security. So here you have Otto Ohlendorf, and this guy would be considered your desk murderer. That he ordered killings. He may have supervised some of the killings, whether he actually pulled the trigger on a gun or not. And I'm not sure that, but a lot of these cases, these were the directors. So how do I even make sense of all this? Well, a while back, I learned about this theory called violentization theory, and trying to explain to criminal justice students, a lot of them in law enforcement, violent behavior was easy to do if you were looking at some individual in some prison system or some setting where we're trying to explain a mass shooter or a serial killer or something of that sort. That was okay to do with the theories, but I couldn't find a theory that worked well to explain, genocide perpetrator behavior. Then I ran into Richard Rhodes' first book on why they kill, accidentally in the bookstore when they still had lots of bookstores, Borders bookstore, read that book and just was fascinated by this Professor Lonnie Athens, who wrote a book a while back, Creation of Violent, Dangerous Criminals. And he went into the prison system and interviewed violent perpetrators who had killed people, who had raped, who had committed assault. And he came up with this theory, and it's called violentization theory. This is a theory that I use to explain perpetrator behavior. And I think that this is what's helpful, is that it's understandable, it's easy to understand, it's been validated in a variety of studies, it makes an intuitive sense. And not only can we teach this to students, but we can also teach the whole idea that it's possible to stop this process before it gets into genocidal behavior and mass murder. And we can de-violentize, move backwards, and the sooner, the better. So this is based on Lonnie Athens' work. There's 5 stages I'm going to mention: brutalization, defiance, violent dominant engagement, virulency, violent predation. It's really a new approach. There's only a couple of us who have applied it to genocide, and it can be used to examine individuals, groups, communities, and entire societies. So the first stage is brutalization, where the person is taught how to carry out violent behavior through observing others. The idea here is that a genocidal or a pre-genocidal script is set into motion. So the whole idea of genocide, and I've been reading Dr. Katz's work as well, who you'll hear from, I think, on Wednesday. And it's amazing how our work is consistent, theoretically. It's different, no doubt. But yet it's still, a lot of times I would tell students, this is just a small part of it. It's a theory explaining a small part, but all these other ideas, the political, the economic, the morality, all these other theories are consistent with this. I'm trying to explain specific violent behavior here. So a genocidal script is developed, and what happens to develop a perpetrator, that the perpetrator learns how to engage in violence. They become horrified by witnessing violence, but they're coached at the same time that they have a responsibility to kill, or they're going to be killed. And then stories are presented about how the perpetrators are victims. That you often see this presented, that in this case it was that Jewish people and communists had created all kinds of problems for the German citizens post World War I, and then moving into World War II. Of course, they were conceptualized as the enemy, and they kind of, you can see in the trials that the perpetrators didn't differentiate between dangerous Russian military and Jewish people. They were all kind of seen as communists and dangerous, including infants and children. And so there's this process of socializing into the violentization, brutalization. Also, if you were to apply this to bullying or other types of violence, you see it works as well. A lot of us see brutalization and may even go through that stage. Many of us stop. I mean, certainly when I worked in the field, I saw a lot of violence, so I'm going to be exposed to all that. I'm going to be working in opposition to it and trying to help, sex offenders or those, engaged in domestic violence to reframe the behaviors and everything. Unfortunately, I learned about this theory after I left the counseling field that I was working in, but I wish I knew about this at that point. Defiance consists of presenting a belief system that supports the genocidal ideas and behavior. And this can, you can see this occurring as a process when the Nazis slowly and incrementally, step by step, became more and more violent. And here the perpetrators define a specific target group for assault. They present where violent behavior is encouraged, and that the person is encouraged to use violence in the future. And that goes into stage 3, violent dominant engagements, focusing on carrying out violent activities So often here you begin to see the segregation of victims for violence and engaging in, the person engages in violence to test out the results, or they direct individuals or groups to carry out violent activities. This is often the place where leaders stop, because what big question, how do you differentiate, how the leaders understand themselves and act versus those that actually carry out the physical killings? And this is how we explain it with violentization theory, that the leaders often, and they stop in the violent dominance engagement stage and encourage others to move on to the next two stages. They supervise, they motivate, but they may not actually kill people, with their own hands, but they encourage others to. And they may threaten to punish those who do not engage in violence. And this is where you get the killers, the virulency stage, where the person or group defines themselves as violent, and they humiliate victims in front of their peers. The group is viewed as violent and dangerous, and they develop a self-identity of being a violent, dangerous group. And then the final stage was added more recently, and that was violent predation. And that is where the subject's violence, according to Lonnie Athens, becomes completely unbound, exceeding the outer limits of humanity. And this is where you have genocidal perpetrator behavior. I came up with this stage in my early work on genocide, and I called it extreme virulency. And Lonnie Athens said, well, let's look at it as violent predation and reframe it as where it moves even further and how that moves. And this involves behavior such as torture, rape, murder, and mutilation of bodies. Basically, and again, in some ways, this is a lot of these genocides. When I was working on my research, it was coming along and everything, and my department asked me to pick up maybe about, I don't know, a dozen years ago or so to start teaching our serial murder course. So I found myself teaching a genocide course, a serial murder course, a criminal profiling course, and usually something like research methods. But what I found strange is the serial murder professionals, the academics, weren't talking to those that studied genocide and vice versa. And same when I started teaching terrorism, there are all these different groups, but yet an integration of these models and ideas, I think, would move us along to understanding how violence occurs. Also, Lonnie Athens studied different communities and looked at what, for our purposes, would be a malignant community where violent interactions become the norm. So I want to move along here so we can get through to some examples. And he also talked about the phantom community, which is the sounding board people use to understand themselves and how they're doing and what they should be doing. It's the internal dialogue that we have. For example, my internal dialogue about teaching on criminal justice, I get from other criminal justice professors I've watched and things I've liked they do, and try to avoid things I'm not too crazy about, and learn from them, and learn from my colleagues and my peers, and from my students, of course, who offer some great feedback. And in cases of genocide, this phantom community, that's the voice people have basically to encourage and support what they're doing. In terms of methods of killing, the Einsatzgruppen went in there, the army would clear the area, they would follow, they'd round up Jews, they'd rob, and then kill them. And they moved from public executions to private executions, which we see. Here's a photograph where they're forcing the victims to dig their own graves. So they would line them up in these huge pits and shoot them, and they'd fall in, and then they'd get another group and they'd shoot them and they'd fall in, and they just kept repeating this and repeating this and repeating this. There's a lot of pictures on Wikipedia. I tried to I weeded out the most graphic because I'm not quite sure, what level is appropriate to have in conferences or even teaching, high school students. What do we have? I always, have to struggle with that, coming from the field that I did, where, I saw everything. So here we see him digging the graves. Here's some women that are being led in the forest to some trenches where they're going to be shot. On the Wikipedia under the Einsatzgruppen, they actually have photographs of the trenches with the bodies filled. with victims and actual shootings, but I decided not to post those in my presentation. They had different methods, 3 basic methods of killing regarding how they lined them up and how they shot them. And they also used gas vans, which they found to be very inefficient, where they would put them in the back and tell them they were taking them somewhere, and then they would lock them in there and they'd put a pipe for the carbon monoxide to go in there. And it wasn't that efficient, but you can kind of see the precursor of, in all of this, you start seeing the precursors of the concentration camps and the mass extermination that was going to occur shortly thereafter. And I don't remember hearing about this till I started reading about it, maybe 7-8 years ago. And here's one of the pictures of the Einsatzgruppen in Ukraine, and you can see the the Einsatzgruppe member there shooting and killing people here. This might be the picture where actually someone wrote a book on this recently. It has a photograph of a woman holding a baby that's being shot, and she does the whole story around that. So sometimes coming up, with specific case studies is helpful, because there's so much information out there. Different types of perpetrators, and Richard Rhodes, interestingly enough, he wrote that book on violentization theory I read many years ago, called Why They Kill, and it was about Lonnie Athens. And then later on, I was interviewed with Lonnie Athens and some others for a video called Why They Kill. If you want to see more on violentization theory, but generally related to violence, for example, in the United States and not specifically genocide, you can see that on Amazon Prime now. It's called Why They Kill. And interestingly enough, Richard Rhodes is on there talking about Masters of Death. They're working on another documentary on his book, and he started studying the Einsatzgruppen. And I thought, wow, that Mr. Rhodes had done all the work for me, basically. He really did. And Lonnie Athens did as well. I stay in contact with Lonnie Athens and had a couple chances to, meet with him at conferences and have lunch with him and talk more about. He's really been a mentor and helpful in moving the theory along with genocide. So violentization theory, I think, explains the stages that the Einsatzgruppen went through to carry out mass murder. But we also would want to look at other factors: childhood socialization, military training, but also the traumatic experiences from World War I. And certainly all that trauma that has occurred to both victims and perpetrators is relevant to studying. Many of these Einsatzgruppen leaders had not participated in World War I. So what happened? They still became violentized post-war. According to Earl, who wrote an excellent book on the Einsatzgruppen trials, she states, one answer is unfulfilled and unrealistic national expectations that promoted aggressive nationalism and race hatred and created ideological soldiers of Nazism. And so according to Earl, the effects of trauma and of the war actually had radicalized many of them. So they had already gone through this, brutalization, this defiance stage, and maybe violent dominant engagements they could pick up on and move forward. So the conditions were were there already with this theory. Interestingly enough, that the Einsatzgruppen members could refuse to obey orders to kill and ask to leave or transfer. Most didn't, but I mean, they were not told kill or be killed, which I found to be the case in my Rwandan case study and my Bosnian case study, where I had some documents from interviews that someone had conducted with perpetrators. And they also, according to Earl, were a new breed of killer, a cross between a desk and first-hand murder, equally comfortable in their offices working on policy or in the field applying it. So according to Richard Rhodes, he asked then the right question to ask about the SS's choice of perpetrators, that is for the Einsatzgruppen, is did they have previous experience with serious violence? And the answer is yes, they were strong Nazis and extremists and many of those that engaged in the killing were from the army or for the police forces. So what we end up having is where people are in law enforcement and the military are trained for defensive violence, they moved it to offensive violence. Three basic types of perpetrators: the novice, defensive, and malefic. And basically here what we're looking at would be the novice basically was a small group that either refused to engage in the murders and killings or had nervous breakdowns. And one of the leaders, which would be another interesting case study, Blobel, one of the Einsatzgruppen leaders actually had a nervous breakdown. And you can look at that case study as well. And the defensive ones went along. They were just following orders and doing what they were expected to do. And then the malefic were the sadistic ones who actually got enjoyment and pleasure of prolonging the agony and carrying out these killings. Also, they celebrated after these killings. They went in on these what they called the Jew hunts, and they would kill hundreds, if not thousands, and then they would go back and have parties and a lot of drinking and food. Rhodes states that in such shared experience, the violent coaching, the social bonding, and acknowledgements of violent reputation necessary to socialize men to film maleficence could flourish there. So again, some more that kind of shows what they were doing there. And then judging men to be cowards who were unwilling to shoot unarmed victims in cold blood was a form of coercive violent coaching the group used. So in other words, that even if there weren't negative consequences in terms of getting killed or being put in jail, if someone refused, they were seen as cowards, and that was viewed very negatively, that label there. The Einsatzgruppen members, many of them reached the virulency stage where violence was used offensively. And I believe it's clear that many reached the violent predation stage that was constructed after Richard Rhodes' book was published. And so we see that. And with the collaborators, the German order police helped carry out the murders. And of course, given the time frame, I'm not going into the detail, but this is an amazing book, Ordinary Men, the Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland by Christopher Browning, a historian. A lot of his writings are very helpful and kind of show that whole process. Soldiers and police are often socialized to use defensive violence, as I mentioned, but they become marginally violent. But with the violentization process and moving them into virulency and violent predation, we have the problem of mass murder occurring like that. And what I also found, and this is what kind of surprised me, is that violent community members also engaged in mass murder. For example, Lithuanian convicts were released by the SS as they had already been violentized and were told to encourage to kill the Jewish citizens. Looking at collaborators, the Lithuanian auxiliary police engaged in bombing, arson, and murder. And these are some of the things that the Lithuanian partisans or Lithuanian collaborators rather had engaged in. I think that's one of the things, of course, to reconcile. And when Sylvia talked about her work there, I kept thinking how there's still a lot more to be done. But I don't know how well this. I don't know if this would go over real well if our university has collaborative agreements with Lithuanian universities. If I was over there giving a presentation, I don't know how well this slide would go over. I don't know. That the Lithuanian auxiliary police made Jews dance in front of crowds while they were beating them and cheering. They raped women, they killed women and children, and the motivation was primarily either financial, anti-Semitism, settling scores, blaming the victims for communist terror, or a combination. So the collaborators got my attention because they went through this violentization process as well. This is from the Trials of the War Criminals, which is readily available. All the volumes are online. You can download. During the first pogrom in the the night from 25 to 26 June, the Lithuanian partisans did away with more than 1,500 Jews, set fire to several synagogues, or destroyed them by other means, and burned down the Jewish dwelling consisting of about 60 houses. And this continued. The Einsatzgruppen found that they could easily encourage the Lithuanian partisans to do their work of killing and murder. They still did that, Einsatzgruppen, but a lot of those, and that's when my grandfather told me that his family was killed by the Nazis and the Lithuanians. That second part had confused me for years, especially as an 8-year-old. It made no sense, and it didn't until, like I said, maybe a dozen years ago, I started reading these books. And you could see when attaching Lithuanian and Latvian detachments to the execution squads, men were chosen whose relatives had been murdered or deported by the Russians. So this is, again, part of that violentization process. They blamed the Jews for collaborating with the Russians, the communists, and they focused at first on killing Jewish men. But then after they had killed Jewish men for a while, they pretty quickly moved on killing women and children. And the rationale was that if they didn't kill the children, they would grow up to become communists that would be fighting against Germany. So they had these really bizarre, twisted thought processes. This is from a report from a mass murder in Kovno. And again, there's pictures on this online. If you look at the death dealer of Kovno, Wikipedia has a picture of him. I had a picture, and it shows him, and it shows just the pure evil in his eyes. You can see, and his expression, you can see the crowd cheering, and you can see, on a good number of bodies just lying there on the ground that he killed them. He clubbed them. And in a cheering and laughing crowd, women held up their children to watch the death dealer of Kovno kill people with large wooden clubs. The crowd cheered at each blow, and this was reported as a retaliation against traitors. And so this is from a book, Clee Dressen and Reese, The Good Old Days. It has all kinds of photographs and history and references. So other reports show this as well. But if you think about that, a mother holding up her 5-year-old child to watch Jewish men, women, and children get beaten to death, I mean, that pretty much is the violentization process of a very young, person already starting there. This photograph here is one of the pogroms, and you can see this woman is being chased and beaten by an adolescent behind her. But I think if you can see this right there, that looks like a young adolescent, right, with a stick, and he, is chasing this woman. And he wants to beat her. So I mean, you had socialized children and adolescents, Lithuanian citizens, to engage in murder. And that was a part of the story I had not really heard before. Clergy members reported, and again, this is part of the thought process. You get these clergy members found children locked in a house and guarded by a Ukrainian teenager with a stick, keeping these 90 children, infants to 6-year-olds, without supervision, without food and water, locked in this small house. The clergy members were outraged, and they weren't outraged because children were being tortured and killed. They were outraged because it would make the Germans look bad and damage their reputation. So this shows you that religion, what had happened with these clergy members, that they could not see anymore the immoral behavior they were engaging in, but instead were worried about the German reputation. And so we have that situation there. And they wrote letters, and Clee Dressen Reese collected those reports that they had. And they're really, it's a tough reading because you see them getting upset about that it won't look good. But then the children were killed, and for the clergy and the Einsatzgruppen and the desk murders, things were then taken care of in that sense. Here's a letter that Karl Kretschmer sent to his wife and kids. And this, again, Clee Dressen and Reese, I quote from their book. This is, I don't know, I'll just read it and you can form your own judgments and opinions thinking about this, but this is what he's sending home. Quote, "I have already told you about the shooting, but you can trust your daddy. He thinks about you all the time and is not shooting immoderately. Rather, it is a weakness not to be able to stand the sight of dead people. The best way of overcoming it is to do it more often. Then it becomes a habit. So you can see that this individual had become violentized. He had gone through those stages into the violent predation stage, and he's telling his wife and kids about it. This is also from a witness, Friedrich Greb, who helped out a lot with testimony and the like. He was a German businessman, and he talks about how he saw this occurring and what had happened. A dozen of corpses of all ages and both sexes in the streets. I had to walk along. At the corner of the house lay a baby less than a year old with his skull crushed. I looked for the man who did the shooting. He was an SS man who sat at the edge of a narrow end of a pit, his feet dangling in the pit. He had a Tommy gun on his knees and he was smoking a cigarette. The people, completely naked, went down the steps, which were cut in the clay wall of the pit, and clambered over their heads, people lying there. He continues, on the morning of the next day, when I again visited the site, I saw about 30 naked people lying near the pit, around 30 or 50 meters away from it. So these are people that Eisengruppen didn't kill in the shootings, but they fell into the pit and they were saved by others who fell on top of them and who were killed. And then they crawled out of the pit. Some of them were still alive. They looked straight in front of them with fixed stare and seemed to notice neither the chillness of the morning nor the workers of my firm who stood around. And the SS then came by later and shot the victims. This here, the blurry picture, one of the things that I was left with when my grandfather passed away, he gave all his photos, documents and stuff to my father. When my father passed away, I got all those documents. One of the things that I think is helpful as far as teaching goes, and I'm not even going to try to look through all my notes on my desk here, but are the Yitzkor books. And my grandfather, I believe this is his town Yanova, or he called it Yanover, which is in Lithuania near Kovno. And this is where his family was apparently rounded up, taken to a ghetto, and then later shot and killed. And I'm still trying to track down exactly what happened. I ended up with his Yitzkor book, and it is written in Hebrew. That didn't help me that much because I don't understand Hebrew. So I just left it on a shelf for a long time. I found out not too long ago that a lot of these Yitzkor books have been translated. And so now about a month ago, I downloaded a full version, 800 pages, and actually found his story, which I don't know where I put it, but oh yeah, here actually is his story, and I printed this out. And this is, he tells what happened to his family. And what's also interesting is that in these Yitzkor books, you get, for example, testimony of someone who was there. My grandfather wasn't there. He had already moved to the United States. He got out of there quickly. He knew what was going on and was worried about it, so he left. But this individual here was able to write about the survivors' experience by witnessing what had happened with the Eisengruppen and others. So we have those situations. I wanted to mention a few other things, but and I apologize for going quickly, but I want to save time for questions, really. That's what so hopefully you have some questions. And I also wanted to mention that further research would include survivor testimony and specific case studies. As I mentioned, I started putting together one on Otto Ollendorf, who was one of the Eisengruppen commanders, based on his testimony, and trying to do kind of a sociological profile of him. I can put up any of these. I can put up this material. I can post it later on during the week if you all are interested in seeing that further. I didn't want to post anything else, so you'd be able to find the presentation easily. If violentization theory works to explain genocide, then stopping at the beginning stages or reversing the stages may help prevent genocide, a deviolentization process. And Lonnie Athens has been working on this, looking at how we try to implement different interventions to prevent violent crime from occurring. And then if you're interested in any of my research on the comparisons of the Bosnian Rwandan genocides, or some of the other material on Rwanda or Bosnia. I also have worked with a police officer in another country, and we wrote a paper on torture and using the same violentization process. I also have a YouTube channel which is primarily for my students, and I can get you all the link to that as well. I do teach undergrad and grad course on genocide, so I have a bunch of material up on YouTube on that. A lot of it's on serial murder because I teach that course, and criminal profiling because I teach that course, terrorism, policy analysis. A lot of videos are relatively boring. But then there's some good ones, I think, too. I mean, my students tell me the research method ones put them to sleep. My research methods course videos, I just couldn't make interesting. But they like the other ones that I made, that it helps them to put things into perspective. And I try to keep them short without going into rambling, into the point. But I think as far as presenting this theory to students, it gives them an appreciation of trying to understand this process. And if you're going to try to teach about bullying, for example, and teach about violentization, you realize bullying is part of that. The bully goes through the violentization process. Same with terrorists. They get through the violentization process. Someone engaging in domestic violence, a violentization process. In this case, genocidal perpetrators. And they did go through deviolentization afterwards, because many of them lived their lives just as they had prior to the Holocaust. So I thank you all, and I think we have some time for questions or comments. So I'll be glad to. I can't see any questions.
So can you see them over on the right-hand side of your screen, Mark?
Let me see if I can minimize this power. There we go. Let me move that. I got them now. Okay.
There you go.
There we go. Okay. Okay, so the first question I see is, will you please elaborate some insights on Holocaust research paradigms? What I would say there real briefly, because that's such a good question, but that would involve hours more to do, is to think about a profession first and then look at what theories they use. And what I did, for example, is I went and I looked at anthropologists, and what do anthropologists say about genocide? Looked at psychologists. What do psychologists say about genocide? I looked at political scientists. What do they have to say about genocide? And that's kind of where I see these paradigms at. And what do criminal justice people have to say about genocide? And so I looked within my own profession, and there was really not much. There's really a lack of research in this area. Genocide has not been. Strangely enough, genocide incorporates every other crime we teach about in my department, but yet we see in general, and I think the only reason we have undergrad and grad genocide courses running is because there is student interest and they fill up. And I was just very lucky to have excellent administrators and department chairs who let me develop these courses, and the university has been very supportive. And so I would go at it maybe that way, looking at the different professions and how do they view it. Because there's big differences between political scientists and how they view the political system and the economic system and the laws, and versus, a psychologist who looks more at individual and small group, interactions. So hopefully that provides a little bit of information, not really directly answering the question, but kind of giving some clues how I went about it, because it's overwhelming to try to just understand all these models and theories. Are there certain indicators to look for when trying to identify specific people or group that might engage in genocidal behavior? And I would say that there are some risk factors. And again, the political scientists have come up with some good risk assessments that look at politically. Some of the big ones, for example, is that there's an identified group that has seen as less than human and unequal and treated unequally and labeled in a negative way and scapegoated and blamed for problems. That's something that we see as a big risk factor there. Often there's some stress or trauma in the group that becomes genocidal perpetrators. What got me really thinking when I did my study on Rwanda, and I looked at Rwanda, I started teaching about how the Hutu committed genocide against the Tutsi. And I thought I had done my work there. And then I went back in 1972, there was a genocide in the neighboring country, Burundi, where the Tutsi committed genocide against the Hutu. And so it's a switch of roles, which, I thought, okay, that's a case study in itself. Also, please recognize that in Namibia, that Germany had already committed a genocide in the early 1900s. That they had gone into Africa and committed genocide against two groups there. And so looking at these risk factors is real important. ISIS is an example of how you saw what became from terrorism moved to what many have considered the genocidal behavior. Studying recent events in Sudan, that we saw over a lengthy period of time how that evolved. I'm interested in the material. If you could post that, that would be great. Thank you. And I'll be glad to post that if I'll transfer that stuff, to PDFs and post that under my bio. Would there be a different approach to have research work on Holocaust history and impact of the Holocaust? Is it historical survey or any other tool in use? What I found is that I originally got a lot of my ideas from some of the historical research, but not having any formal training in being a historian and doing historical research, I was all over the place. And so what I found is that having the violentization theory helped me have a model to put that historical perspective into something that worked for an action-based behavioral model. And so in a sense, historians are describing what happened there, and then I'm trying to interpret the actual behaviors and almost looking, if you might say, the multiple causes, if you will, more at a smaller group level. And that's one of the problems that people say with violentization theory. Does it really focus on individuals and small groups, or can you talk about a violentized society? And I think you can on all accounts there. Why would genocide be included in law enforcement training? Current law enforcement training as it relates to group behaviors focus on riots and protests, not genocide. That's an excellent question. That was one I was worried my department chair back in 2001 would ask me when I told him I wanted to teach a course on genocide. He kind of looked at me and he said, okay. And he said, do you think students will be interested? And I said, oh yeah. He said, do you think you'll fill it? Yeah. He said, well, let's see how it goes. And he didn't go into any details about that. I can tell you how I got that course going, possibly. I don't know. I taught the first course, I think, a little bit after 9/11 occurred. When after 9/11 occurred, or on 9/11, I got a call that my classes were canceled because I was teaching law enforcement cohorts. And things were just chaotic because they were getting all kinds of reports and they were all over the place and no one knew what was going on, really. And so basically they just told me to kind of hang out. And so I went to the bookstore on 9/11 and bought the only book I could find there on terrorism because I didn't know much about it. And I went back to my office, and my office mate was a terrorism expert. Our previous department chair that let me teach the genocide course, also a terrorism expert. And that's what everyone wanted to know about, terrorism. I didn't know much about terrorism at all. So I started reading about it. And for some reason I said, you know what, I don't want to teach about terrorism. I want to teach about genocide. That's something that, it's not there in our field. And so I started writing about it, developed the course. I published some articles, and I think I got those articles published because nothing else had been done in that area like that. And so then I taught the course, and I wondered too about, it's helping law enforcement officers gain an understanding about how violence can occur, what to look for, some of the risk factors. But what I found, strangely enough, is one of my students contacted me after the course was done, one of my grad students who worked in a law enforcement agency and also conducted terrorism training. And she said, Mark, I'm using all your material for my terrorism training courses. She said, it's all the same, all the stuff, how people become violent, how people, it's different degrees, different levels, but you have to have some model, you have to have somewhere to go with. And certainly if you look at the German Einsatzgruppen and German order police, that is why it's so important, I think, is that they're called ordinary men, but they were also police, and they committed so many millions of murders. Same with the Einsatzgruppen and the Lithuanian auxiliary police. And we see that also in the Bosnian genocide, that the police became part of the problem rather than the protectors. And so I think it gives them a different perspective there that can be helpful, that they hopefully never will have to use, but it may help them understand how to develop more peaceful communities. Have you heard about the Uyghur camp and a clear resemble to the violentisation theory in the Holocaust? Yes. We have seen more occurring, like in Myanmar, for example, and in China, what may be clearly genocidal behaviors occurring against different groups. So that continues to be a problem. The problem is, I'll give you an example. I got a complaint once, if you can believe that, from a professor that I didn't cover a genocide, because I had published an article about teaching about genocide, and I started with the Holocaust, and she was quite upset that I was missing one. And I said, no. I said, I cover that one in my undergrad class because we start at 1900 and move forward. I said, in my grad course, we go into a few genocides much more detailed, and I start in the Holocaust. And so she's like, oh, wow. I said, but now I'm going to have to go ask my department chair if we can have 2 courses now at the grad level, part 1 and part 2, because we need that. And the problem is that we keep having these genocides occur, and we just add those to the list. Since I've been teaching the course, I've added maybe 4 or 5 genocides that have occurred just in the last 15 years. The best way to stop genocidal behavior really is to be able to prevent it from moving to that stage of virulency. And even in the violent dominant engagement, when you start seeing small things happen that start possibly becoming larger, it's important to stop it there. And that's where we failed miserably in a variety of ways. The United Nations is just a wonderful group that fails miserably to prevent genocide over and over and over again. I mean, and maybe that's not their role, but if you look at the Bosnian genocide, it was complete chaos before. The Rwandan genocide could have been prevented as well. Now you had President Clinton going in to apologize. You have France apologizing to Rwanda for not doing much or anything. And see, we had the opportunities when we saw what was going on. And so if you look at the more recent cases of Rwanda and Bosnia, you see, the process, and especially Sudan, that we saw, it's nerve-wracking to just kind of watch it and see it get worse and worse and worse. And I think it was it General Powell, Secretary of State was a Colin Powell at the time. He waited, and finally he couldn't wait anymore. And I think he said, "Oh, was it Sudan?" Where he said genocide was occurring, but it had already been occurring for years and years and years and years. And so early intervention is the primary way to prevent genocide, real early, and to put in whatever procedures we need. And there may be situations where there needs to be specific military interventions or economic interventions, and it needs to be a world approach with multiple countries cooperating to prevent. I mean, do you remember Saddam Hussein gets a trial for committing genocide back in, the 80s. Well, how did that happen? That he was able to, kill his own population of, a group there and get away with that for so many years, and it was never stopped. And so, for example, and we see this going on and on. And so that's why it's important, I think, for politicians to understand this too. I can't say I've ever worked with any politicians that I'm aware of working with, or I've limited contact with politicians or administrators or people in those positions. But I certainly would hope that they read this research, they listen to what I hope. And again, to go back to training students, is some of my students actually have gone into politics, and some are now running for pretty high up offices. And I'm thinking, hopefully, I have so much encouragement that the students that come out of our program, when they do stuff like that, they're going to do some really great stuff, and they know what's going on, and they're not going to let these crimes happen. Other questions or comments?
I've got a quick question for you, Mark.
Sure.
So, in teachers that are interested in wherever they are and starting a secondary, high school level semester Holocaust course, one thing that I've always recommended, and based off what you're saying, I hope it sounds right, is that if it's a semester course, then possibly the first semester course be sociology or anthropology. The idea of like using the foundation of sociological perspectives to help them in understanding the behaviors, rather than just using it to help them use those various lenses or how we understand behaviors within society, applying that to the study of the Holocaust, so they really are able to look at it in a more holistic way rather than just as a series of events. And would you agree with that? Is that something that you think is beneficial, or you recommend?
Very much so. And I like the idea of, you want to look at the big picture, but sometimes I think if you can take one detailed case and that helps them get a greater appreciation, I think. That was the problem. I went in there when I started studying genocide, studying the Holocaust overwhelming, studying, 15 genocides, I couldn't even think by the end of the day, that I was so confused, or trying to put everything together. And what I found is that, taking a particular approach and having a particular emphasis or focus was helpful, and let the textbooks that I use help with some of the others. I also found what was helpful, and I don't know how this will work in, the high school setting, but with my students, I told them in their papers that they would write, that they could select any genocide they wanted to. Because I had a student from Argentina once, and she wanted to write about the Argentinian genocide, which I didn't cover at all. And I said, please do, and if so, students have an interest in a particular genocide or area, I encourage them to pursue that in their papers, because they already have that interest there. Or if they have an interest in a certain topic, and that's what I think is a key there. And that's the problem I run into is trying to focus on something, specifically, and still embedding that in the big picture. But I think that it's just overwhelming, and you have to start small, maybe, and not try to cover everything. That's the thing. I realize that I cannot cover everything, and of course, in the classroom, my students know they can sidetrack me real easily by asking a question totally unrelated to, and I'll go into that, and then I'm thinking, and the next thing I know is we spent the last 20 minutes of class on that topic rather than the other. But I think that sometimes is beneficial, because that's what that person and maybe others in the class wanted to know. I mean, something that I don't even know if this is discussed or not, but I know there's discussion of trauma on Holocaust, second and third generation trauma and all that. But I started, students start asking me about, when they get into the field studying this stuff, have like traumatic events and bad dreams and things like that. One of my students in my serial murder course said he was reading the stuff, listening to the presentation. He said he was having nightmares, and all that. And I recommended, I said counseling, might be helpful. And one of the things with my students going in there to be crime investigators, homicide investigators, and terrorism and investigators and all that. I get 220 people taking my serial murder class every semester. And I have to wonder why are so many people interested in serial murder? I try to stay away from that topic. But at the same time, there is that interest, and it's real important for me to, present it the best I can. But I'm always worried, about the trauma, or do we ever do? Is that something that's been, Stephen? Maybe I don't. With sex crimes investigators, we have. It's a small group, and we know that trauma occurs, and that people cannot work in that field too long. Well, some do, but many don't. They spend 2 or 3 years, 4 years, something. They're out of there before they burn out completely and secondary trauma kicks in. But we didn't really talk about that until the last 4 or 5 years. We start discussing that more, writing about that. But I think that's the whole thing too, is what kind of effect does this have on all of us studying genocide and the Holocaust and all this violence? Do we have any preparation for that?
I don't, at least when our courses, getting them prepared for that is really difficult. But I think that in my students, when we would cover in sociology, we talk about the behaviors and try to have them kind of a step back, because I want them to personalize it. You want them to take it in. You want them to feel everything, especially when you're wanting them to connect through survivor testimony. And you want them to humanize the victims and not just see a number, but you also don't want them to be traumatized. I think one of the issues that we run into, you brought up a really good point in showing your slides about removing some of the more graphic imagery. And one thing that we talk about, I don't think there's a need to necessarily shove graphic imagery down the throats of students to realize how horrific the event was. Sometimes the appropriate testimony and going through and listening to someone's story and making that connection. I mean, even with using books like the salvaged pages. I mean, even actually, I've had excerpts I've used from Ordinary Men, only because that book in and of itself is fairly graphic in its description of violence by itself. And I think it's important to let them know and to be that voice and let students have discussions so they don't go home with it alone. Because a lot of them go home with it. You show the liberation of camps at Bergen-Belsen, and people will show these videos, so they'll show these horrific scenes, thinking now I've really shocked them into being aware, but it doesn't do anything more than shock them. And some students leave feeling a little more traumatized. And I've had students who really, after my first few years teaching it, who would say, I need time to break this apart. I need time to discuss with, and if you just send us out without reflection time and discussion time with other students, it's just sitting and weighing. And after that, you start seeing more students go home and having discussions with parents, with friends, and bringing up these topics and conversations so they can really try to understand more than just soak in the imagery of what they've seen and try to, look at, you said, people have asked, how do you address these behaviors? And, you said we have to start at the beginning, where they come from, address the root causes, and that's what they focus on, and to, in an effort to not get to that end point. You've got one more question up here I was going to ask.
Okay.
And I was just curious also on this, because Stacy asked, how do we answer students who say, why does genocide continue? And if we have the responsibility to step in, and you mentioned the Rwandan genocide, and I'm only gonna just ask you this point because there's an interview that Madeleine Albright has during the Rwandan genocide when they were asking her about it and what are we going to do? And she continually referred in her interview to the Rwandan genocide, during the process as acts of genocide. Would not say it is a genocide. And then of course, we never stepped in. So I'm just curious as to if there's no vested interest in our stepping in, when the vested interest should be a human cause, what's going to get us to step in?
one of the things I think is important is to throw it at the politicians to be responsible in a appropriate way, you know, how to say it, you know, and to have the pressure of those who actually can, you know, publicly make the statements to say, no, you know, Madam Albright, that's not, you know, this is a genocide occurring and you know it. And the reason we're not identifying it is because once we identify a genocide, then we're legally obligated to do something about it. And that is where the politicians drive me up the wall. All politicians, you know, are trying to do what is, you know, probably the route that is best for them and their constituents, certainly. And if you think about, you know, identifying a genocide and having to do something about it, you have to bring everyone on board too. They may not, I mean, I don't know. It'd be interesting to look at a public opinion poll on, you know, how much concern people have about Rwandans overall throughout the United States. And I'm sure Rwandans have great concern, you know, about their family members and people and family and friends that they know. But, you know, what about someone who's never even heard of the country Rwanda? And you find that, I mean, sometimes, you know, been out drinking a cup of coffee and someone said, what are you doing? I said, oh, I'm reading about Rwanda. And the, you know, grown adult says, who's that? You're like, oh, it's a country. And I'm thinking, okay, they've never heard of Rwanda. Well, and then I can tell them, oh, a terrible, you know, explain briefly. And then, you know, they're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm sitting next to a professor. What a terrible error I've made here. You know, they have to go real quick. But, you know, but people, I think it's, and it's also the numbers thing. You know, I read an article about, I think it was a dog that was on a raft floating in the ocean and millions of people tuned into it and they thought, oh my gosh, we have to save that dog. We have to save that dog. And thousands of articles and all kinds of, you know, video and everything. And they saved the dog and everyone's happy. But then you have the Rwandan genocide and you have literally photographs and, you know, of thousands of people getting murdered. And that's too much. Once it becomes more than what someone can identify. If you can take a kid, and I would do that with my class, is I would tell them about a case in the Bosnian genocide about this young kid, I'm sorry, in the Rwandan genocide, about this young kid who, you know, that the perpetrators take him to a well and behead him and try to poison the well with his head. And then I say, but let me tell you about this kid and a little bit about the background behind him. That's so much different than saying, you know, 5,000 people were, you know, hacked up with machetes yesterday in Rwanda. You know, if you're telling about the genocide that occurred at the time, people are just like, wow, that's bad. But if you tell them about that one 5-year-old kid and what happened, that hits them. That would hit politicians. And I think it would make them more responsible. The unfortunate thing, I mean, I think we have to figure out how to manipulate politicians to take action. And I think one way is that if they, you know, they don't do something, they're going to be seen as ineffective. And that goes for all the politicians. And I think if politicians work together to prevent genocide, we should support them 100%, whatever party they're at. You know, that's one of the problems too, is that party politics comes into play, and or we don't have time to deal with this genocide, or this doesn't affect the United States, it's way over there, but it really does. And to get others involved as well, that, you know, many people say, well, the United States shouldn't have to go at it alone. And I would agree that we already have, you know, the responsibility for protect. And I think we're slowly moving in that direction. But, you know, I thought that, you know, 20 years ago when I started, you know, studying all this, that we wouldn't be having these conversations, that we're still working at it. You know, that we'd pretty much have it down. And the political science people have done some wonderful work on how to set up, you know, for the politicians and the military leaders and, you know, those that are working. What I think we can do is we can reach those that work with the politician. I have students who are doing internships with politicians. I have a couple that are running for office, you know, former students. And I'm thinking, wow, that, you know, I have some that were, you know, chiefs or sheriffs of police departments or, you know, agencies. And I'm thinking, hopefully this is something that I can pass on to them. And with high school students, you even have more time to get them on board with doing something when they go into a particular field. that they realize how important it is if they go into a field where they may have some direct impact. So, some of my students now are in their 50s, some of my first students, and some are older, of course, but I mean, some of the younger ones are now, I mean, that's, and they've had long careers in different, situations. So I think it's important to get it out there. And I think also we have to figure out how do we, help the journalists and the press present it to get people on board as well. And I think sometimes those stories where they, go out there and they talk to one family who's had a victim in their family, something that happened recently, they talk to the mother of that kid who got killed and sent into the well, and play that. That may resonate more than just these reports that, a bomb was dropped and village burned in Sudan. End of story. And it might show some video from far away, but we need to personalize those people that are victims and survivors. So we think of them, as our neighbors or as our coworkers or our family or our friends or whatever. And then I think it takes on a different meaning.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I went ahead and typed in the chat kind of if people needed to go. I told them that they needed to head out. I want to thank so much really for taking for your time today and for speaking with us. Honestly, I think a lot of people really want to see your presentation and the things that you have, because the idea of putting this to work in a classroom, because some teachers may not have a choice in being able to, and being able to integrate, a behavioral class with social studies, with the Holocaust studies, or for that matter, when we talk about their classes, semester courses in African American history or women's studies, I think would pair well with these behavioral studies to help really go into that. And I think what you've given everyone and looking at the Holocaust a different perspective and a different lens, that really helps start a discussion. And I've already seen some great discussions taking place in the chats, as well as even over in the communities. Any of the speakers are always welcome to jump in the communities and, with the discussions, but I really think what you've given us here is something to start with. And I'll probably reaching out a lot more. So, because we're going to try to create some lessons and, that teachers can use. And I really appreciate the time you've given us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And again, if anyone wants any of my syllabi, even though they're undergrad, grad level, or my assignments or anything like that, just send me an email, mark.winton@ucf.edu, or send me a way to contact you outside of the group here, an email or something. I'll send you all that stuff. No problem at all. It may take me a couple of days, but I'll definitely be more than happy to send you all those links or those, whatever is helpful. Just let me know and I'll get it for you.
Fantastic. And everyone, as I wrap up here, everyone's getting ready to log off, but I am going to post all the sessions. I do have to upload them and get them linked in to all, so you can rewatch any of the sessions you want to. I'll be sending out Word documents in regards to the reflection logs. That way, I know some of you, I'm going to try to find an alternate way of posting that so you can have access to being able to type inside the boxes a little better. I know that's not easy for everyone to do. And after tomorrow's sessions are just recorded, you watch them on your own time when you want. You do not have to watch them first thing in the morning or at the times that they're listed. They'll be open to you in the morning, anytime during the day. And then our next live session will be on Wednesday in the morning with Dr. Fred Katz. And I'm looking forward to the engagement. You guys have been fantastic today. I really appreciate all the hard work and collaboration that I see going on. It has been wonderful. If anybody has any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to me either through the Whova app, or feel free to send me an email. Again, Dr. Winton and any of the speakers that are remaining online here, thank you all so much for a fantastic session. I really have enjoyed thoroughly listening to everyone today, and for all the incredible teachers who are taking time out of their summer schedule to come here and attend this, to learn more, to edify themselves, and to work with us on really getting Holocaust education in front of students and being able to find new ways to do that. And that's all I have for us. Thank you so much. Mark, thank you again, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye-bye,
everyone. Thank you.